Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on strategic allowable uses of federal ARP HCY funds. My name is Zach Stumbo, and I'm the state homeless coordinator. I'm delighted to have you here today, and I'm excited to be joined by our guest speaker, Karen Rice from Schoolhouse Connection. If you haven't yet already, go ahead and mute yourself. Beginning with this webinar, you will see new accessibility features, such as an interpreter and live captioning automatically on your screen. We hope that these features improve your learning experience. Now I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker, Karen Rice. Karen is a renowned expert in the field of homeless education. She has an extensive background. She has an extensive background in working with, I lost my spot. Karen is a renowned expert in the field of homeless education. She has extensive experience working with Schoolhouse Connection, a national organization dedicated to ensuring educational rights and opportunities for children and youth experiencing homelessness. Karen brings a wealth of knowledge about the McKinney-Vento Act and other legislation like the American Rescue Plan, Homeless Children and Youth, which we call ARP HCY. I'm grateful that she's joined us today to share her expertise in those areas. During today's session, she will provide you with an overview of ARP HCY funds, including allowable and strategic uses, best practices from liaisons implementing those funds, and strategies for planning and implementation. Just a reminder to make sure that you're muted. I'm going to check to make sure everybody's muted. Okay. Before we dive into the content, I'd like to set some expectations. This webinar is designed to be interactive and engaging. We encourage you to ask questions, share your thoughts, and participate in discussions throughout the session. We want this to be a collaborative learning experience for everyone involved. To ensure smooth operation, please be mindful of these norms. Today's video will be recorded for those who could not be present. Please ensure that your video feed is professional in nature and not distracting should you keep it on. Please keep your audio muted unless asking a question. Please use the hand raising icon to gain the presenter's attention to ask a question. The chat function is available for question asking, and it will be recorded as part of the content. At the end of the webinar, a link will be added to the chat for you to complete. This will serve as your proof of attendance, but the comments will be reviewed anonymously. You must wait till the end of the session to get the link as part of your attendance. This is how you will receive your certificate as your hour for credit today. Thank you once again for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand it over to Karen to get us started. Karen?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Zach. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I am going to just get myself settled here by sharing my screen with you. Just give me 1 second. Can everyone see my screen okay? Perfect.
Yes, we see your screen.
Excellent. All right, and Zach, I will ask for your help again with the chat and with any hands that get raised during our time, but please feel free to pop your questions in the chat or any ideas that you have. This is a great time for me to hear from you as well. So. All right, so let's jump in. So today we are going to be talking about, as Zach mentioned, ARP HCY funds, known as ARP HCY or sometimes ARP HCY. So apologies if I use those interchangeably, but they do mean the same thing. So just as we begin briefly about Schoolhouse Connection, I just wanted to let you all kind of know, if you haven't had a chance to work with us at all, this is who we are. So we are a national organization that works to overcome homelessness through education. And we cover really a wide spectrum of working through early childhood, K-12, and higher education. We also have state and federal policy advocacy that we do, as well as a scholarship program, which I am very excited to tell you that we have. Our scholarship application is open. So if you have students that you are working with that might be interested and eligible for our scholarship program, please watch for more information on that. I will share that with you all, the link to that at the end of this. And I'm having a small technological glitch over here, so give me just 1 second to figure this out. Apologies.
Do you want me to pull it up to share?
I think I got it. I don't know what happened. All of a sudden, couldn't see it on my screen anymore, but I think as long as you can still see it, we should be good. Okay.
It's not in presentation mode, if you could make that.
There we go. All right, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Sometimes technology is like the best and the worst of all the things. All right, so sorry about that. So, okay, so jumping right in for today, we are going to look at some context and examples of the funds, as well as talking through planning and sustaining the funds. And so I think we're in kind of a unique and murky sort of time with ARP HCY, and just kind of this world of, we have approximately 14 months or so to get these funds spent. And what I have heard from across the country is that districts are still really in this mode of trying to figure out how are we going to use the rest of our funds, while also thinking through sustainability and planning through how to continue the programming and the initiatives that have begun with the funds. And so it's a little bit tricky because we're kind of in the murky waters of navigating both sides of it. So I'm going to share some examples and just kind of talk through some different tools and resources that you can use as you're planning moving forward and thinking through sustaining the things that you've begun with the funds. And so I'll provide you with links to those resources as well. But just very briefly as an overview, ARP HCY funds support the specific and unique needs of children and youth experiencing homelessness. So first and foremost, we know that our students have needs, right? They have a lot of needs in terms of just thinking through what mobility, how that can affect students, and thinking through just some of the trauma that our students have been through, and attendance and graduation rates. We know that our students have unique needs. And so this is an excellent opportunity and an amazing opportunity that we've been given to meet these needs with these funds. So thinking through what are those academic, social, emotional, mental health needs that we have. And the purpose of the funds is really to support, first and foremost, identifying our children and youth experiencing homelessness and making sure they're enrolled in school and that they're participating, but then also to think through what those other wraparound sorts of services might look like and how to really support what those unique needs are. So these funds, of course, are supplemental to other funding sources. So what that means is we want to think through what are we doing with our other funds that we can also support our children and youth experiencing homelessness with, and then use these funds on top of that. So for example, if we're already doing something with our Title I homeless reservation set aside funds, ARP HCY funds can be used on top of that to supplement what's already happening with those funds. Other COVID relief dollars that have come out through ESSER and through GEAR, those can also be used to support children and youth experiencing homelessness. And then again, the ARP HCY funds can be used kind of on top of that to supplement and to really go above and beyond what's happening with those funds. So the expenses, of course, that we're using our funds for must be educationally related. So we want to make sure that we're thinking through how does this tie back to the student's education? And certainly when we think through different uses of funds, we know that that looks really different in a lot of ways. So when we think through maybe providing transportation services, obviously students need transportation to get to school. Or when we think through providing some additional food resources and food support for students, children and youth who are hungry, of course, can't learn, right? They're not ready to learn. And so we want to think through what are those needs that students have that we can tie back to their education and make sure that as we're thinking through how to spend the funds, that those are educationally related. And so one of the things, I'm sorry, Zach, go ahead.
Karen, right now on my screen, we're not seeing the bottom banner. And I just wanted to pause and let people know that there is no information on the bottom banner except in slide 18. And so they're not missing anything. If it's like mine, they're not missing anything. But would you point out on slide 18 when we get there?
Yeah,
If their presentation is like mine, it's not a big deal, but I don't want them, if they're wondering, they're not missing anything.
Okay, so my apologies. Let me jump right back in and say that one of the best ways to figure out how to use the funds is to conduct a needs assessment to really determine what that best use of funds would look like. Now, I know that we are on a very limited time to do that, and we're running short on days, right? We're at roughly 14 months to be able to spend the funds. And so to really start through a comprehensive needs assessment process is going to be really difficult at this point. And so I recognize that, but I would still say that one of the things that you can do to really determine if you're still trying to figure out how to use the funds and you're looking into a new school year thinking, okay, our students are coming back. What is it that our students need and what can we do to best support them at this time? I would really encourage you to take a look at your data. And it doesn't have to be a really deep dive into your data, but look at last year's graduation rates or last year's reading proficiency scores or things like that to say, maybe we can hire an extra tutor to provide some additional support or increase hours of a teacher who might be willing to do some reading tutoring or after school programming or something like that. And so really looking at that data will give you some ideas of how to use the funds yet this year to really meet those needs in the best way possible. So while we talk about a comprehensive needs assessment, that was sort of the goal when the funds came out, was to really look strategically at what the needs are. But at this point, I would say it's still a good idea to look at your data, but maybe not as comprehensively as you could have or maybe did at the beginning of when the funds were released. All right, so I want to just kind of set the context for the use of these ARP HCY funds. So this is from the Department of Education's guidance. This is probably nothing new. You've probably seen this before. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. I would rather spend some time on giving you all some examples of things that are being done and to really think through, what you can be doing and what you're already doing and how you might take some of the things that you're hearing today and try them out or modify them or make changes to them or whatever that might look like in your district. So I'm going to go through this part fairly quickly and I'm going to kind of skip over some of it. But I would encourage you to go back and look at the slides, and you will have access to these slides after today. So I'll make sure that you can take a look at these more closely if you'd like to. So first of all, as I said, expenses need to be reasonable and necessary to support children and youth experiencing homelessness. And so above all, the Department of Ed has said, again, facilitating that identification, enrollment, and educational success. And that's really broad and looks really different in many places. And so that's one of the benefit of these funds, is that there really is much more flexibility and so many more broad uses that the funds can be used for to meet those needs of students. And so we want to think through, are we connecting students and families to enrichment programs, to wraparound services in whatever that might look like, whether that's academic, whether it's trauma-informed care, mental health services, providing any needed supplies. Of course, PPE is not as necessary as it was at the beginning of the pandemic. Many of our students are no longer wearing masks and things like that. And so it might not be that, but it might be hygiene items that students need, or school supplies or glasses to really be successful in school. And so these are things that are really the purposes that are permitted under the EHCY, or the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. And so allowable uses under that umbrella are also allowable under ARP HCY. So I mentioned transportation, providing transportation, and we at Schoolhouse call this kind of our big T word. Transportation, we know, is one of the biggest needs that students have and that districts have. Transportation is really difficult these days with driver shortages and just trying to really make sure that students are getting to school. And so transportation is an excellent use of funds to make sure that children are attending and participating. Purchasing cell phones or other technological devices to make sure that students have access to what they need, And again, I would say at the beginning of the pandemic, this was especially necessary when thinking through computers and things for virtual learning. However, we know that students are still doing a lot of work online, or they still need access to a computer to complete homework or classwork outside of class. And so you can still think through what those technological needs might be to continue to enhance the opportunities that they have to access their programming or to do their homework or things like that. The biggest change with these funds has been paying for short-term temporary housing. And I will say this has been a bit controversial, and we've heard this from many places. The Department of Education does not define what short-term temporary housing is. They say in their Dear Colleague letter that it is, for example, a few days. So that's kind of been what we have worked off of at Schoolhouse as well, that kind of 2 or 3 days is that temporary short-term following a few days is what's listed in the Dear Colleague letter.
Karen,
But yep, go ahead, Zach.
can I offer our advice?
Absolutely.
We generally advise that it's an emergency and 2 days here.
Excellent.
And just for people to, when people ask me, I offer that advice, and you know, for them, I encourage for them to, you know, keep a record of what the emergency was or some sort of thing like that. Whatever, good record keeping practice that they would do, that the liaison might do. That's what I personally do when they reach out to me for it. But 2 days is the standard language when I speak to them.
Perfect.
Sorry to interrupt.
Nope, that's fine. You are welcome to interrupt anytime.
Thanks.
And I would say that that's a really great, one of the reasons that this has been such a challenge for so many districts to try to implement. We know our families really need this short-term housing in many situations, that, you know, if a family gets evicted and they have nowhere to go, providing this short-term temporary stay in a motel or a hotel for 2 days can give them a chance to figure out their next step, to connect with somebody else, or to figure out who the next resource or the next housing program or something might be. And so it can be really critical for those families. But I do want to say that we recognize that it's been a challenge, because in many districts, business offices have said, we are not sure how to track this. We're not sure how to make this partnership work. And so there are a lot of places not doing this, and that's okay too. And just know that it's an option, and know that it's named specifically from the Department of Education in this letter as something that you can do, again, as Zach said, for 2 days on an emergency basis.
And I'm happy if somebody wants to reach out. My email will be in here for the specific language, and I believe we've included it in a prior homeless newsletter, the specific language, but February's newsletter. The specific language about it was in February's newsletter, but I'm happy to talk to someone by email about it too.
Perfect. And then providing store cards or prepaid debit cards to purchase materials necessary to participate in activities. And I will say this is another one that's been a challenge, and it's been difficult in a lot of districts, again, for that kind of tracking and auditing purpose. I do want to say that our guidance is that this is a great use of funds when we have students who have needs. And so working with business office staff and fiscal people in your district can be a really critical part of making sure that students have what they need. There's been a lot of ways that districts have found to kind of work around trying to figure out some of those different tracking pieces and kind of the auditing business office side of it. And I put out a full caveat and a full disclaimer every time I talk about this, because we love business office staff. They do a job that I could not ever do. And so this is not something that I say that they make it difficult, but they're trying to follow their policies and procedures while we're also trying to meet needs of students. So that collaboration is really, really crucial to help make sure that this can be done effectively. And so I'm going to share some examples in a few minutes about how some districts have kind of navigated with some of the store card questions. So hang tight if you have more questions about that. I'm going to share some examples in just a minute. And then increasing program capacity. And this has really been done in a lot of ways. In some places, it's been done by increasing liaison hours. Some have added program staff, or staff to look at data, or staff to provide tutoring and things like that. So we're going to talk through some examples of what that might look like as well. But just wanted to kind of briefly talk through those examples, or those specifically listed things in the Department of Education guidance. Okay, so I'm going to jump into examples, and this is the part that excites me so much because there's so many cool things happening around the country right now with these funds to support students. And so it's exciting to hear. And so I want to say that if you're doing something cool and innovative, or you think it's cool and you might not know if anybody else does, please put that in the chat because I want to hear from you about that. And I'd love to share your examples as well when I talk about this. So the examples that I'm going to share today are examples that we have heard at Schoolhouse. So these are not coming from the Department of Education. This information is just directly from Schoolhouse of what we've heard in our conversations with liaisons and states. So just kind of that disclaimer on that. So I'm not going to read through all of the uses of funds on this slide. Instead, I'd like to focus on talking more about the examples. So increasing outreach and identification is really, really huge and important. We know that not all of our students have returned back to school after the pandemic and after many schools were virtual or had a hybrid. Students moved and they had high mobility during that time, where they might have moved to another state or they might have moved different places and not re-enrolled in school. And so that identification and outreach this is probably one of the most crucial pieces, making sure we're connecting with our students and we're identifying our students so that they have what they need. One idea that I've heard from a district in Nebraska is that they have hired a summer navigator as well as 2 family liaisons to work during the summer months to maintain contact with families. They were finding that over the summer, they would lose contact with their families. They wouldn't be checking in with them regularly. And then when it came to back to school time, they were always scrambling right before school started to make sure that their students were identified and that they had the services that they need to start the school year. And so instead of kind of scrambling at the last minute to make sure that that was happening, they hired these summer staff to maintain contact with families, to be talking with families throughout the summer months of, where are you? What needs do you have? How can we support you? And that way they were able to have the students identified because they knew those living situations over the summer months. So they could make sure at the start of the school year that students were identified and ready to go for that first day of school. There's a district in Ohio that did a targeted marketing campaign to connect with families. It's a fairly large district, and so they had a number of families that that they kind of lost track of during the pandemic. The students didn't re-enroll, and they kind of just weren't sure where they were, and they weren't sure how to best connect with them. And they wanted to make sure they were identifying all of the students that they possibly could that needed their support. So they contracted with a billboard company to advertise for their McKinney-Vento program. And I wish that I had the language of the billboards to share with you, but they put them in their community on like major highways and places where families were, so that families could see like, hey, are you in this living situation? Here's who to reach out to at school. And so they had an increase in identification from families who shared that they had seen these billboards around the community. And so they did that at the beginning of the school year last year. And then again in January, right before school started after winter break, because they knew families had that was the time when families were going to change their living situation or experience a change in their living situation. And so they wanted to make sure that families coming back to school after winter break also knew that if they had lost their housing, that here's who they could contact. So they had a really successful increase in identification because of that. And so I've heard a number of other places that have considered doing kind of that targeted marketing and outreach using social media and doing a social media campaign, things like that, to connect with as many students and families as they can.
Karen, we had a question about spending the money by the 14-month deadline. And I said it kind of depends what you're purchasing and when. Do you want to deal with that question at the end or now?
We can talk about it now. Let's pause and talk about it, because I think it's important as we're talking through these examples to think of what that might look like within the timeline that we have. So this is a great question. Thank you so much for putting this in the chat. So the funds have to be allocated by September 30th of 2024. So this is kind of this is the timeline that we operate on kind of in our heads at Schoolhouse when we talk about funds. So we're thinking between now and next September, we need to make sure that those funds are allocated for a specific purpose. So whether that's transportation or school supplies, as the person mentioned in the chat, We need to have those funds earmarked for spending for that purpose by September 30th of 2024. We then have until January 30th of 2025 to do all of the final expending of funds. So after January 30th of 2025, the funds are no longer available. So we've kind of got that brief window between September of 2024 and January of 2025 to make sure we're doing all of that final spending, if that makes sense. So the funds can be earmarked for purposes to be used over the entire school year or kind of until those deadlines come about. Does that help clarify? If you still have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. I can.
No, well, I was wondering if they were maybe referring to, sometimes we get a question, and sometimes this is with McKinney-Vento districts, but since we're running up against the end of ARP money, ARP HCY money, I think we'll get questions like this about travel towards the ends of it. And we might run up against a situation where they'll want to spend it for NACCE registration, where they could spend it right before for the NACCE registration in 2024, but they wouldn't be able to spend it for NACCE plane tickets because NACCE would be in November. And federal guidance considers it obligated when you make the travel. So that's something important to keep in mind for 2024. It's something that I wanted to point out that maybe our McKinney-Vento districts are familiar with, but the ARP districts aren't as familiar. The ARP HCY districts wouldn't be as familiar with. Am I misinterpreting that, or?
So with the caveat of saying it might be different in your state because different states have different ways that they're navigating this. As long as my understanding is, again, barring any Kentucky specific information, if the funds are earmarked for and they're allocated like within a budget for that travel and for that registration, as long as they're spent and they're completely spent down by January of 25, they're allocated by September 30th, you know that you're going to spend $2,000 or whatever it is of that money on travel and professional development. As long as it's spent down then, and that's its final expenditures are done by January, is what we have been telling people. Now, again, it could be different in Kentucky with the process of budgets and budget approvals and things like that.
Is it okay if we bring in my director, Tara? Are you on the line?
I Tara am. Put in the chat. Yep.
Sorry. We partner with a law group, and so I just want to make sure that we have it clear for our people here. Tara, do you mind to speak?
No, you're exactly right, Zach. So I'm not sure which funding pot you were talking about. If it was well, I guess it's for ARP. It's the same one. It ends. The obligation date is September 30, 2024. Correct?
It is.
Okay, so you could not take travel after that date, even if you had a plane ticket paid for. You could not take the travel after September 30, 2024, and pay for it with these funds. So Zach is right, you could do the registration, but the plane ticket, even if you purchased it and you had it completely paid for, it wouldn't matter because the funds are not obligated until you take the travel and you get on the plane. And same with I think the same with the hotel and everything. So the registration would be the only thing. So none of the travel.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to have cross speak because we have an interpreter. We are covering obligation in this coming newsletter in more detail. So I don't mean to get sidetracked on that, but it's something that we've invited people around the state to come on that we're working on statewide. So I just wanted to clear that up because a lot of our ARP HCY people aren't as used to it as McKinney-Vento when I work with them intentionally, especially with NACCE, because it's going to be near a deadline. So I just wanted to clear that up with our director for the division. So.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes. And like I said, there's different things that we've learned from different states. I worked with a group recently in California, and they have a different deadline based on their fiscal year and their fiscal calendar. They've set very different deadlines and expectations for how things are with their liaisons and their districts. So I know that there are some kinds of different things. And so, yes, it's really, really important to clarify state specific, because my only experience is kind of looking at that big picture and kind of what we're. So thank you for jumping in and for clarifying that. I appreciate it. And please keep the questions coming. These are really great and sparking great discussion. So even if we don't get through all of the slides, don't worry. I'm happy to share them out with you. But it's good to answer questions and to have the opportunity to interact around this. So thanks very much. All right, so jumping back into communication and wraparound supports. These are a few that I want to highlight that I think are really important when thinking through kind of that short-term temporary emergency housing piece, as well as the store cards. There is a district in California that is partnering with Motel 6, and they have a number of Motel 6 buildings within their school district. And so they created an MOU with the Motel 6 that they are able to place families. I believe their limit is 3 days, but again, semantics, because the guidance says a few days. So, so for your purposes here in Kentucky, stick with 2 days, but this particular district is able to put families in for about 3 days in a motel. And so they have this partnership with Motel 6 that the assistant superintendent has been very involved in this process, and he created this MOU. And so what they do is he is able to make those reservations for families, but specifically named in their MOU is the liability question, because this has been the #1 concern that we've heard from districts across the country that have wanted to do these short-term temporary motel stays, but are concerned about the liability and what happens if someone gets hurt or if something gets broken and who's liable for that. And so they've laid that out in their contract very clearly and very specifically, that the district is not responsible for what happens. Now, on the flip side, to kind of work with that and to support the Motel 6 process, they have their liaison is named on the reservation for the family. So they give the family name, and they also give the name of the liaison and the contact information for that person. So if there's a question or if there's a concern or something happens, they have a direct contact to who at school they should reach out to help support that family. And they've been really successful. And so they haven't had any concerns. There have not been liability issues at all with any of the families that they've placed in the motel, because they have that direct connection. Now, they've called the liaison on a number of occasions when the children haven't gotten on the bus to go to school and things like that. But it's been a really successful partnership because they laid it out very clearly and very specifically in their contract with them. So they've had a really good partnership with Motel 6. And they're thinking of ways of sustaining that through the support of some organizations in their community because of how successful it's been. I also presented at a conference in California a few months ago and had the opportunity to hear about a district who has a partnership with hotels.com. And so this was a little bit of a lengthy process to establish this partnership, but they are able to purchase hotels.com gift cards. Again, they've got a partnership with them, and so they've kind of worked out some of the details. And so when they have a family who needs that short-term emergency housing, they purchase a gift card from hotels.com for the exact amount that the family will need. And the family takes that gift card then and makes the reservation in their name. Again, that's their way to navigate that liability concern and that liability issue, because then it's in the family's name. And so they've used their funds to purchase those gift cards to provide that temporary housing. So just a couple of ways that folks have navigated that. There's been some other more easy, simple, not going through the contract or the MOU process, but partnering with community organizations that we've heard of and things like that for those short-term housing opportunities. When I mentioned store cards before, we know that that's also been tricky for districts. So there's a district in New Jersey that they went and purchased a number of store cards in bulk from the sort of major store location in their community. And the liaison partnered with her business office to try to figure out the best way to navigate and track the expenditures with those gift cards. And what they finally landed on is that when families have needs, they come in and meet with the liaison. And it's the liaison's way to look more comprehensively at what the family's needs might be. So students who need gym shoes to participate in gym class, the family or the youth might come in and meet with the liaison and talk about, okay, here's what I need with shoes. But it gives the liaison opportunities to say, do you need snacks for after school if you're, playing sports or on activities or extracurriculars, things like that? Do you need gym clothes? Do you need hygiene items for after gym class? And so the liaison can look kind of more comprehensively at what the student might need. And then the liaison purchases those items with the store cards so that she is able to then track exactly what's been purchased. But they're able to have the items delivered either to where the family is staying. So they have a number of families that stay at a shelter that's near the school. They're able to have the items delivered to the shelter or to a school staff member who can then get them to the students. But so that's one way that they've kind of navigated the store card piece. There's a district in New Mexico that hired a community member to serve as a housing navigator. And this is a really interesting model because it's someone from the community to make sure that it wasn't just another school staff member. And so they worked with someone in the community who families already knew, they already had connections to, and someone who was just kind of familiar with the community processes. And so that community member is now a school employee. She works about 5 to 10 hours a month, actually, so it's very limited hours, but she's able to help families make sure they have the housing support where she can go with them to the housing office, or she can help them get into shelter or things like that. And so having someone from the community has really helped kind of bridge some of those school community partnerships that they've had, and they've had a lot of success with that position. And then finally, one other example in this category, there's a district in Alaska that purchased cell phones and minutes for students, particularly for their unaccompanied youth. They found that they were having a really hard time staying connected with their unaccompanied youth, and so this was a way for them to use funds to really help maintain that communication. The youth are able to text the liaison on their phones and keep in contact so that if the students don't get to school, they know what other options they have to try to pick the student up or to send alternate transportation, things like that. And so they've had increased engagement and increased attendance because they've been able to stay in communication better.
Can I ask a couple questions I have about the cards?
Absolutely.
One would be, how do you, I see benefits to it because it keeps away from bulking up on unnecessary sizes and materials of things, right? You don't have to buy a whole bunch of shoes in different sizes. How do you, what happens, or have you talked to people from the federal government, like, how do you safeguard, or what happens when you have all these cards, or how do you keep from having these cards left over or given out before the end of the deadline?
That's a really good question. And so what many districts have tried to do is to figure out kind of typically what their needs are, what they're hearing from students. And then I know a number of districts who have also planned that they typically purchase a number of school supplies for students anyway. And so their plan has kind of been, we'll purchase half of what we usually do. And then with whatever remaining store cards that we have, we'll use the rest of those store cards to purchase the materials before the deadlines. So like they typically buy notebooks and pencils and things like that. They bought half of what they usually do. And then if they have those store cards left over, they'll buy the rest of those school supplies that they would need on hand for students. And so that's kind of been one of the best solutions that I've heard to make sure they know that they would need the supplies anyway, and that's a typical thing that they do in their district. And so they kind of have planned for that. But it's hard because there's not really a way to do that when you buy them in bulk. And so one of the easier ways I think to do that is, I recently talked with a district that they have a purchasing card. The liaison has a purchasing card. And so she's able to just use that like school district credit card to purchase what she needs. And then they take that out of their ARP HCY budget. And so it's eliminated the need for the store cards that they may or may not end up actually using. because she has direct access to, okay, the student needs a pair of shoes for gym class. I'm just going to use my credit card, my district credit card, to purchase those shoes. And then when I submit the receipt and the information to our business office, the budget code that then I give is the ARP HCY budget, and they take that directly out of there. So,
okay, I guess two quick ones, because I'm getting questions about these cards, and so I want to try to clear these up, right? Another would be, how do you cut down on fraud, waste, and abuse? Specifically, I live in Louisville, and there are some businesses that will buy gift cards at a reduced rate. Do you know any districts that have found good ways to cut down on fraud, waste, and abuse?
I think, well, particularly with gas cards, I would say yes. So when districts use their funds for gas cards, there are a number of gas stations around the country that do fuel-only cards. And so a family could not take that card into a gas station and use it to purchase whatever else. One of the things that we have had a number of conversations just on our internal schoolhouse team is we want to make sure that we're meeting student and family needs and not assuming the worst of families, right? Like,
sure.
It's the language that's written in a number of different places in guidance, and I want to choose my words very carefully about this, is that we want to make sure that our families are not using things for purposes other than meeting needs for their students' education. But I think, when we really think about it, our families know and our students know what it is that they need and what they need to do. And so I think I'm trying to be very careful. We want to make sure we're not assuming the worst of our families when we're providing them with these. And so I think one of the ways to make sure is either to find if there are ways to do kind of those store cards that are like, again, the fuel only for the gas cards, or I know another district that has partnered with their local Walmart, and so they have store cards that when families use this particular store card at Walmart is tracking what the family is purchasing and providing that information back to the district. So they can say families came in and they use this. We're tracking the gift card, the number that's on the gift card. Related back to that, we can see the family bought pencils and shoes and socks. And so they can kind of track through, like Walmart is keeping track of that for them. And I don't know how that's happening on the Walmart side of that. But then they're able to look back and see, okay, our families are using them for these purposes, which is one reason they're doing that, is to help them to know for the future. And then after they don't have the ARP HCY funds, to say, it looks like our families really consistently need socks. Maybe we need to think about doing a sock drive to make sure we have enough socks for our families, or things like that. So it's also a way to kind of plan for some of those future needs.
I appreciate that. And just to be clear, the state doesn't endorse any specific vendor or company or gas station or anything like that. So those are all local decisions, what people do that way. Those are all local controls and things like that. So I appreciate that. And it's part of my job to ask these questions and to help elicit this information. For those of you who don't know, I spent time as a homeless student when I was a junior and senior. So I try not to assume the worst of families either, but it's part of our jobs to also balance that with the fraud, waste, and abuse. So thank you for the information.
Absolutely. And I mean, you can't say with 100% guarantee that it won't happen, right? And so I will say, if there's partnerships like the gas stations with the fuel only cards, or this particular partnership with Walmart, I think my overarching point of that is there are so many places and businesses to partner with that have different ways and different things that they can do to provide you the information that you would need. And so, yeah, maybe with certain Walmarts wouldn't be willing to do something like that, or certain gas stations that don't have those fuel only cards, but building those partnerships within the community is going to be beneficial even when the ARP HCY funds are no longer available. So I did also learn recently of a district that has really leveraged a partnership with their education foundation. And I thought that that was really brilliant. As someone who worked in a district with a very active education foundation, as a liaison, it never occurred to me to partner with them. And so they have different, in this particular district, they have different sorts of accounting procedures and things that they're able to do in their education foundation because it's not tied with their district accounting practices. It's a separate entity. And so this particular education foundation was able to go out and purchase store cards in bulk, that then when the liaison needs something, she calls the education foundation and they say, yeah, we've got gift cards or store cards to XYZ place. What is it the student needs? You need shoes? Great, here's the store card. And so the education foundation manages those and purchases those with the ARP HCY funds. It was an agreement that they had.
What is an education foundation?
That's an excellent question.
Sorry,
Yep.
we may have a version of that in Kentucky and not use the term.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So education foundations are typically, I don't know all the ins and outs of like if it's an official like nonprofit designation, but it's an organization that provides scholarships and like resources back to the school. So in the district that I worked with, they were definitely separate than the district. They had their own sorts of bylaws and governing principles and their own fiscal people and things, but they partnered with the school. And so teachers could apply for scholarships from them to do certain things in their community. We ran a huge event at our high school that I wrote a grant for and was funded through our education foundation to do a big event at our school. And so it's a way for them to kind of give back to the school, and it's affiliated with the school, but it's not an actual like part of the district. It's its own separate sort of entity. So those are great partnerships to have if those exist where you are, to really leverage those and to see who else kind of within the realm of the school world you can work with to meet those needs. So I do want to be just really aware of time. We've only got about 10 minutes left, and I've got a lot more examples for you. But I want to just talk through some of these mental health examples, and then I'm going to skip ahead and talk through kind of some of that planning and sustaining and thinking through how to use funds, because I think that's really important in this sort of time period that we're in with coming to the end of funding availability. So just very briefly, we know that mental health concerns are on the rise with students across the country, with all students. And so we know also that with our students experiencing homelessness, there can be significant amount of trauma. There can be a lot of different things that homelessness has affected the student. And so thinking through the use of how to provide these mental health supports for our students is really important. We know that many districts are bringing therapists or mental health professionals into schools, but that's also not always an option in many places. So just a couple of very brief examples. There's a district in the state of Washington that's purchased an online mental health curriculum to specifically support anxiety and stress in students. And so students have one-to-one technology, so they've all got their own devices, and they can access this mental health curriculum either at home or at school on their school district devices. And it gives coping strategies and just really helps students to kind of navigate through some of the stress and anxiety and give them tools to cope and support what they're feeling, and kind of just, it's a way for them to have that kind of extra support. And I've heard from the liaison recently that students are taking it home and they're talking about it with their families, and they're accessing it at home and sharing with their families what it is that they're learning, so that they're taking that support that they're receiving through this online program and being able to share some of that with their families or their caregivers at home. And so it's been really an effective model. Yeah, the name of the program is called Camp Cope a Lot. So let me drop it into the chat for you. So something to think about, definitely. And there's a district in Maryland that's doing some after-school small group counseling as part of their after-school programming. So they provide after-school tutoring for students, and that's something that they did prior to receiving ARP HCY funds as well. But with their ARP HCY funds, they are paying stipends to some of their school counselors who go to these after school programs. And while students are getting help on their homework and doing other things, they're able to pull together small groups of students to do some small group counseling within that setting that's already happening. And one more that I want to mention really briefly, because I really love this, is there's a district in Minnesota who recently had a very significant influx of unaccompanied youth, but unaccompanied immigrant students. Unaccompanied in the sense of experiencing homelessness and also with their immigration status. And these students were really struggling to engage in school. And so they contracted with a mental health provider who is both bilingual and bicultural, to work with these students to navigate the trauma of their immigration experience and their homeless experience. And so this therapist comes into school and meets with a small group of students regularly to kind of just process through that they had a traumatic immigration experience, and now they're in these living situations that are causing a lot of trauma and that are really kind of unhealthy situations. And so this therapist works with them to help get them to a place where then they can go to class and be ready to learn. And so it's a really unique model, and I really love to share that that's happening because we know so many of our students are in that situation right now. So just wanted to very briefly share those. I do have many more examples, which I will put in an email to Zach so that you've got some additional ones with these other areas of funding. But I do want to just skip ahead. So my apologies for skipping quickly through slides. Okay, so very briefly, just a couple of key takeaways from all of this. We want to make sure that our ARP HCY funds are not replacing other funding sources. So again, if you're paying for a reading intervention to work with your students experiencing homelessness through your Title I set aside, ARP HCY funds can be used to support that, to increase those hours or whatever else that might look like, but you don't want to pull that funding out of that Title I. So you want to continue to use this to supplement and to do on top of what's already happening. Make sure you're thinking through a plan to spend the funds down before the deadline, and then thinking through that sustainability. So I want to very super quickly share with you these resources. So we created a planning tool to help spend the funds and to kind of help plan for, I'm going to drop this link in the chat for you so you've got it now. You can look at what I'm seeing. To really help plan for what to do and how to kind of move through the next few months. So it offers ideas and suggestions for different times of the school year, but it's really designed to be looked at regularly and in collaboration with others in your district, because as you're thinking and you're planning, we want to make sure you're also thinking about future funding and how you can partner and work together with other funding sources to continue what you're working through. So just some considerations for going through that planning process. Again, we don't have a lot of time to take a look at these, but thinking through what data can you use. And the data is going to be so important, not only for planning purposes, but also to make a case to sustain the work that you're doing. So I have a liaison that I work with regularly in New Mexico, and my favorite line that she's ever said to me is, nobody can argue with data. If you've got the raw numbers and you take them to someone and say, here's what we're doing and here are the outcomes and here's what's showing up in our data, you can't argue with the numbers. And that's what she's really done to make a case for continuing the initiatives that she started with her funds, is she's been very intentional about collecting and looking at her data as she plans and as she tries to figure out, do we increase this or do we move funds over here? She's using her data for that, and then also putting it together to go back and to be able to provide an argument for sustaining and funding with other options after ARP HCY. All right, I'm going to skip ahead very briefly and share with you this sustainability tool, because this is really, again, as I said, we're kind of in this murky time of we're figuring out how to spend our funds, but also sustain our funds. And so we have created this resource to also work through as a sustainability plan. And I will drop this into the chat as well, so you've got it. And there are, I just want to say very briefly that there are a lot of different ways to think through sustainability. A lot of different funding sources that are out there that we maybe haven't considered before as liaisons. I will say when I was a liaison, I was funded out of like 5 or 6 different funding sources, and it never occurred to me to try to make them all work together to do my job differently or more effectively. And so this is really an opportunity to think through what's out there, and how can we really have our funding sources work together. When we think about mental health, can we access Title IV services? Can we partner with Title IV in our districts, for example? And so there's a lot of different options. And so this tool will really walk you through what those options are. And I do have in the slides some examples of how districts have thought through sustainability and what their plans are. But because we're short on time, I'll let you take a look at those once you've got the slides. And you can always reach out if you have specific questions about that
Karen,
afterwards. Yeah.
While we have our accessibility features, I need to remind.
Oh, Zach, you're on mute.
Karen, while we have our accessibility features, I need to remind people that the link for ELA credit is in the chat. And if they are on their phone or they are unable to reach it, to please email Jennifer White at KDE or myself, and we will send them the link.
Beautiful.
And we're available through the website if they need us. Go ahead. And we have a few minutes to stay after. We have 5 or so minutes to stay after if somebody wants to hang back.
Perfect. Well, I will wrap up just by saying this, that now is the time to think through the sustainability piece. As you're thinking through your plans and as you're planning out now this next school year, thinking through what that sustainability is going to look like. And my best piece of advice to you is to have a seat at the table during these conversations. As you're meeting with your fiscal office staff or your budget people or your business office, have a seat at the table, meet those people, have them know who you are, and be a part of those conversations as you're thinking about funding sources and funding options. And leveraging those community partnerships or those other partnerships within the district is going to be really critical. All right, so I know we don't have a lot of time. If you have any questions, I would welcome you to put those in the chat. I can also follow up with you after if you have questions. But I did promise you that I was going to mention briefly our scholarship program. So if you have students who are going to be entering college for the first time in 2024, so this is their senior year of high school, and they have experienced homelessness within the last 6 years, please encourage them to apply for our scholarship. It's an amazing program that's not just a financial component. There's also case management through the end of high school, into college, and then through graduation and college. They get to do some really amazing trips that are some advocacy opportunities for students. So please help us spread the word. We would love to support as many students as we can with that opportunity. Thank you all so much. That was so much information in a very brief amount of time. You are always welcome to reach out to me, and I know you're always welcome to reach out to Zach as well. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time today. It's been wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. This is wonderful. We are here, I believe we're here for the next, I think we booked the accessibility features for an hour and 15 minutes. So we can stay that long. If you're comfortable, I'm comfortable to stay here that long. And then I have an appointment to get to at 11:15, but I can hang back for any questions.
I'm happy to answer any questions as well. And as I said, I'll put some of these examples that we didn't get to into an email for Zach so he can share with you the slides and the rest of the examples.
I would like to take this time also to answer. I'm having to do the captions myself, editing for the first email and everyone, or the first webinar. And I will be sending that out to all liaisons at the same time. And this has captioning provided with it. And it will probably go live. We'll have an internal discussion about that. But everybody will be notified at the same time. Because this is time sensitive, I imagine we'll be able to send the PowerPoint out soon. No questions?
That means everyone's got it figured out.
Then I want to know why your local balances aren't spent. Probably not allowed to ask that.
I'm so sorry. I was trying to, this is Lucy, and I was trying to send a chat message, but I'm on my phone and it wouldn't let me.
Lucy, where are you calling from? I feel
I'm
like
calling from
I've always wanted to be a talk show host.
Rowan County in Moorhead. So good to be with everyone from across the country. But yeah, I had been trying to chat throughout, and it said you have to add at least one person to chat, and I thought, well, I have a whole bunch of people that I'm trying to chat with. But anyway, I will watch for the link, because obviously I can't get on to do the evaluation, but I'll watch for that. And thank you very much. It was a lot of good information.
Okay, Lucy in Rowan County needs the link, so Jennifer will send that to her.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nobody has any questions for ARP money? Do we have any other homeless questions? Okay. Seeing none, I'm going to end the webinar. I want to thank our accessibility people who came today. Kathy Dyke, thank you. And our caption person, I'm forgetting the name, but thank you. And I will see you in 2 weeks for our next webinar. And what is that one on, Karen?
That one is on FAFSA and post-secondary transition. So I'm very excited. My colleague Jillian, who is an expert on all things higher ed and FAFSA, will be joining to talk through that.
And that's my favorite topic, actually. So I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.